Hi. I've known Karen Cooper for a long time now. Many years ago, I suggested that she share her photos of Minnehaha Falls with our Linden Hills History Study Group, and she has returned to us several times since then with new information every time. During the pandemic, she developed her stories of the falls, especially the rowdy parts of its history, into the book which we are celebrating today. I've read the book, and I loved her conversational style and witty, sardonic turns of phrase. Starting in 1996 or 1997, Karen began actively researching the history of Minnehaha Park. Some of you may be familiar with Karen's website, urbancreek.com, which she developed in 2000 as a vehicle to share her research. The information and photos on the site help provide an uncomfortably complete history of Minnehaha Park in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The falls have been a popular place to visit for Native Americans in the past and became a tourist attraction after the publication of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha. But from the 1880s until at least 1912, Minnehaha Falls was a scene of surprising mayhem. Drinking, carousing, sideshows, dances that attracted unescorted women, and general rowdiness reigned. The Star Tribune recently published 2 articles about Karen, one about her raucous ramble tours of Minnehaha Falls, and the other a review of When Minnehaha Flowed with Whiskey, A Spirited History of the Falls, published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press, which came out in August of this year. Karen's book has gotten extensive praise from local historians and the news media. The Star Tribune review is one of the most positive reviews I've ever seen of a new book. Frank Burris said, "Her account is a lively and fun read, and the book is filled with rare images from her collection. It's a must-read for anyone who cares about the history of the city, of the state, even of the country, because in rescuing this messy, loud piece of our past, Cooper has helped to make our story more complete, more real, and more true than it has been for some time now." And now on to what we came for, the telling of the story of Minnehaha Park from the book When Minnehaha Flowed with Whiskey. Welcome, Karen Cooper.
Thank you, Laura. That was really nice. And I understand it's your birthday, so happy birthday.
Oh, thank you.
Everyone, hello. Thank you all for coming. I'm really delighted to be here with you to help the Linden Hills History Study Group wrap up their year. I just moved out of Linden Hills to Bryn Mawr, so I'm close. And I understand there's even people from Edina in the group, so you haven't seen the last of me, I think. As you know, my name is Karen Cooper, and I'm a historian. And I've studied Minnehaha Falls for a very long time. It seems that I have a great deal to say about it. And of course, I've been able to publish my research in this new book, which we're here to hear about. And I want to tell you up front that my book has a terrible, glaring, horrible flaw. There's this one huge change that I would make if I could. If I could show you hundreds of pictures of the falls, I would. I would show you all of the details and all of the color and all of the excitement that I find in old pictures of Minnehaha Falls. I became a historian because I'm a photo collector, and I actually own thousands of pictures of Minnehaha Falls from the 19th century. And I built the story that's in my book on this foundation of all these images. But the reality of publishing and printing means that I could include 40 or 50 pictures that are printed in black and white in my book. Today, though, I have a chance to show you some pictures in color, even if that color is sepia tone. And I have a chance to talk with you about details in the book, details in the pictures, and I can show you some things I wasn't able to include. And so this is going to make a richer story, and I'm really glad that you're all here today and that I can share it with you. So I'm going to talk at first about how the waterfall becomes famous and beloved, and of course then the rowdyism that takes over the place. Now I start with talking about geology. I explain why there's a waterfall in our little prairie city, and then I talk about the settlement at Fort Snelling. Drunken mayhem is an important part of the early Fort Snelling story, and while my book is focused on this corner of Hennepin County, I do reach out for some broader themes, including these sentiments from Mark Twain, who wrote, "How solemn and beautiful is the thought that the earliest pioneer of civilization, the van leader of civilization, is never the steamboat, never the railroad, never the newspaper, never the Sabbath school, never the missionary, but always whiskey. Such is the case. Look history over, you will see. The missionary comes after the whiskey. I mean, he arrives after the whiskey has arrived. Next comes the poor immigrant with axe and hoe and rifle. Next, the trader. Next, the miscellaneous rush. Next, the gambler, the desperado, the highwayman, and all of their kindred in sin of both sexes. And next, the smart chap who has bought up an old grant that covers the land. This brings the lawyer tribe. The vigilance committee brings the undertaker. All these interests bring the newspaper. The newspaper starts up politics and a railroad, and all hands turn to and build a church and a jail, and behold, civilization is established forever on the land. But whiskey, you see, was the van leader in this beneficent work. It always is. It was like a foreigner, and excusable in a foreigner to be ignorant of this great truth and wander off into astronomy, to borrow a symbol. But if he had been conversant in the facts, he would have said, westward, the jug of empire takes its way. And the main takeaway from that is that in those early days when the Army built Fort Snelling, pretty much everybody was drunk pretty much all of the time. The soldiers were given 4 ounces of whiskey a day, and they could buy more. And whiskey was, in those earliest days, and in the words of General George Washington himself, not to be dispensed with. And so at Fort Snelling, we had this early beachhead for drunken, rowdy behavior, and this spreads, as we will see, to the little waterfall to the north. Now, I'd like to describe a little bit about how Minnehaha becomes famous, because our little waterfall, starting in the 1850s, is a worldwide phenomenon. People came from everywhere to see it, even before Minnesota became a state in 1858. There are 3 reasons for that. The first and most famous is photography. There's a man named Alexander Hessler who took an early photograph of Minnehaha Falls in 1852, the first picture. He was on a photographic expedition to also take pictures at St. Anthony Falls and at Fort Snelling. Now, he'd come upriver from Galena. He had a studio there, and he had an apprentice and partner in Joel Whitney in St. Paul. And it happens that most of the earliest surviving pictures of Minnehaha Falls from the 1850s were taken by this Joel Whitney because he lived here and this Hessler didn't. Now, this picture shows on the south side of the creek, on your left, is still the military reservation of Fort Snelling. On the other side, it's open to claimers, and there's a claim held there by a man named Patrick Maloney. This is probably from 1855. It could even be earlier, but I believe it's such an early photo because of what we see in the picture. The creek is really covered over with bushes and trees. It's all kind of grown over, and that's how early visitors described the falls area. They found it hard to even find the waterfall. They couldn't find the creek. There was so much bushes and trees and so on. And of course, then the photographers would have worked hard to hide any signs of human activity, but we just don't see any what I call the works of man in that picture. Now, steamboats were the only practical means of travel in the 1850s for people who wanted to come up and see the great Northwest, see the Minnesota Territory, the frontier, and that's the second reason why Minnehaha became so famous, and that's travel. In 1854 was a celebration that was national news. Every newspaper carried stories of the grand excursion. They were celebrating because the railroad had finally come all the way west to the Mississippi River. One could get on the cars, as they called the train, and travel in speed and comfort all the way to the river to see the West. And it was easy for the ladies to do, so by the thousands, people came once this excursion had opened the door for people to visit the frontier. I write this in my book. The Grand Excursion was a sellout success. The train set out from Chicago on June 5th, 1854, drawn by engines festively decorated for the 8-hour journey to Rock Island, Illinois. All were celebrating the milestone. The Mississippi River had been linked to the Atlantic seaboard by iron rail. After the expected speeches, wherein former President Millard Fillmore notably held forth, the voyage began with wavings of flags and gun salutes. The steamboats arrived in St. Paul a day early, with those on shore and those on board in high excitement. The welcoming Minnesotans scrambled to organize conveyances because the early arrival rather inconvenienced everyone. They were set for the arrival the next day, and the Easterners managed their dignity with varying degrees of grace. A single horse cart allowed 3 crowded editors to see the sights of this fashionable tour. The group toured the towns of St. Paul and St. Anthony, and they took every available wagon to see the sights: St. Anthony Falls, Lake Calhoun, now Bede-Makaska, Fort Snelling, and Minnehaha Falls. The guests admired the boundless, glorious country and were feted at the state capitol. By 11 p.m. on the same day they arrived, they turned around on their steamboats and cast off for the return trip. The entire excursion on the river lasted about a week, but the publicity it generated was an entirely different matter. Eastern editors published glowing accounts of the grand excursion, which excited the public imagination for the upper Mississippi and for the Minnesota Territory. And this enthusiasm may well have been the route for news of Minnehaha Falls to reach the ears of the poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. In fact, he may have had an in-law on the grand excursion. His wife was from the Appleton family, and there was a William Appleton who was listed in the New York Times as being on the excursion. And there was a son in that family who was of the age to take the trip. But be that as it may, less than 2 weeks after the excursion concluded, Longfellow began to write a poem called The Song of Hiawatha. Now, he never came to Minnesota, but he made Minnehaha Falls famous when he had his main character, Hiawatha, come to the falls and meet the maiden Minnehaha, and they fell in love. Almost the entire poem takes place in Michigan, not here in Minnesota. And that one connection, however, Hiawatha coming to the waterfall, was enough to make our waterfall world famous. And that's because the poem was a worldwide overnight success. By the big sea shining waters, by the big lake Gitche Gumee, was the wigwam of Nokomis, daughter of the moon Nokomis. You guys probably know at least that line, right? It was in the cartoons when I was a kid. It might be the most famous line in the poem. Now, the local affection for this poem was so great that it was used to name all kinds of things, and you know this: Lake Nokomis, Lake Hiawatha, Waban Picnic Area, Nawadaha Boulevard, Keewaydin Neighborhood, streets and schools and businesses. Everybody takes names from this poem because we have so much local pride in our waterfall being part of that story. Now, Longfellow, as I said, never came to Minnesota, but he knew about the falls from that grand excursion and from a fellow writer named Frederica Bremer, and I have a whole theory about that, which I cover in some detail in my book. However, that's not the saucy part of the story. So let's move on. All of the attention from photography, increased travel, and the worldwide phenomenon of a poem meant that people really, really wanted to come here, and they did, by the thousands. From the 1850s, Minnehaha Falls was a very popular destination. Now, in contrast to that earlier picture here, we start to see that the trees and bushes are being cut down and taken down, and obviously there's that fence. The built environment begins to appear in these old photos. By the 1860s, the military reservation had been bought, all of it, lock, stock, and barrel, by a man named Franklin Steele. He owned Fort Snelling. And he also owned the claim on the north side, the Maloney claim, and so it was Steele who built the fence that we see here. And here is a little more of that fence, which was surrounding Franklin Steele's roadhouse. It probably dates from 1858 or 1859, certainly before the Civil War. People said it was a dingy wooden building, and this is the beginning of the time when the falls becomes a source of income for the people who owned it. And this is a great idea. That flood of tourists, thousands of people a year, keep coming, and everyone wanted conveniences when they came to the falls. And this is what I write in my book. At the restaurant, homemade dinners can be had for 75 cents a head. There is no charge of any kind to visit the falls, and the place is much frequented by picnic parties. Now, early on, the place is under the care of a man named Boyden, who was known to have run first-class accommodations there in the 1860s. Now, at this time, the place begins to be called the Minnehaha Hotel, though we don't know how many rooms it had or really any details about it. We do know that after the Civil War, a man named Captain Milo Palmer was put in charge of running this rural refreshment house, this earliest version of the Minnehaha Hotel. He was a Civil War veteran. He'd served with the 12th Wisconsin Infantry and was injured at Vicksburg. His leg was paralyzed severely, but not totally. After the injury, he was sent to Fort Snelling, which he commanded until the end of the war, and then a year and a half later, he was found running this refreshment house. still quite close to Fort Snelling. And this was a festive place. This man found a way to illuminate the waterfall at night, which was a show-stopping occurrence at a time when there was no electric lights. Now, Palmer offered ice cream and lemonade, but also choice wines and liquors, and he was prepared to serve meals and drinks at any time, so late-night carousers were welcomed here. This was a year-round establishment. In November of 1869, the waterfall was just beginning to freeze, and a St. Paul photographer, partner of that Joel Whitney I mentioned, whose name was Charles Zimmerman. Zimmerman comes to Minnehaha. Probably he wants to take photos. But he was clamoring around behind the falls, which is dangerous. Kids, don't go back there. And this icicle comes loose. It knocks him out. It knocks him down. And he's left there, seemingly for dead. He's alone. Someone finds him 30 minutes later, and they hauled him up to Palmer's Roadhouse, where they offered him proper restoratives and kind of brought him back to life. Those proper restoratives surely meant whiskey. And we are quite certain that whiskey was involved at this roadhouse because Franklin Steele, the man who owned it, had a liquor license, and this is it. They have it in a box over at the State Historical Society. The date here is 1863 to 1864. It's an internal revenue license issued by Hennepin County, and what that indicates is that the government is using taxing of liquor sales to finance the Civil War, and they did that with postage stamps and lots of other things too. Now, in addition to his hotel, Steele made people feel welcome at the falls by providing small helps like this little bridge so that people could stand in front of the picturesque perfection of this glorious waterfall and admire an unobstructed view, the falling water. The ladies especially loved that. There was a staircase that he built to lead down the bluff. We have staircases on both sides today, but this is the very first one, and that's just to make people welcome and comfortable at the falls. He wanted to make sure people had access to this place he was busy making money from. Now, he didn't run the roadhouse and hotel by himself. He hired people to work for him, including a man named George Lincoln, but he was never far away. He had a farm right there, and he lived at the falls until 1867. Franklin Steele is the man responsible for the railroad running right past the falls because he gave the easement to run the tracks across the military reservation. He wanted the train to stop at Minnehaha Falls to bring ever more people there. So George Lincoln becomes his partner, and he is ramping things up into the 1870s, and this is what I write about that. Minnehaha Avenue was platted, running from the growing city of Minneapolis through the country farms straight to the famous waterfall. Since 1865, the railroad had connected Minneapolis to the big eastern cities and offered cheap round-trip fares to the locals. And now the new road was going in. Getting to Minnehaha had never been easier, and Lincoln decided to make improvements on the hotel. He spent $30,000 on this project. He enlarged the bar room and the kitchen. He built a new bar, and he improved the dining room. The parlors were refurnished, and plans were developed for a huge barn to stable the guests' horses and rigs. And a newsstand went up that was selling fruit and candy and had a sitting room just for the ladies. Picnic parties were invited to use the newly built picnic tables, and they were always provided with free ice, which seems like kind of a big deal back before we had refrigeration. Because dancing was a primary way that men and women socialized, he also had a large outdoor dancing platform built. I've never seen a picture of it. I've just read about that. Lincoln improved another one of Palmer's amenities. He had a platform built near the falls so that guests could stand in front of the waterfall and have their pictures taken and take a souvenir photograph. Captain Palmer seems to have moved his hospitality north, and George Lincoln invites Boyden back to manage the house, and Boyden advertised meals with all the luxuries of the season at all hours and any quantity of ice cream. Now, this is an example of the sad limitations of a printed book. I don't get to show the details of pictures like this. I love looking at the small details in pictures. And this is, of course, just a blow-up of what we just saw of the hotel. We don't know if George Lincoln and his wife Vinette and his daughters Fanny Grace and Florence and Bertha are in this picture. Maybe they're hotel employees, maybe they're guests, and maybe if I had enough time and resources, I could figure that out. But that kind of curiosity is where I really really built the story of the book. Now, newspaper stories excitedly it reported all of these improvements at the hotel, and they also warned Lincoln and Steele. They said, "The falls are unsurpassed in the world in point of fairy-like beauty, and nature has set upon the surroundings the seal of earthly perfection. It now remains for the proprietors to treat with courtesy and consideration all tourists and visitors, and keep the house and grounds free from rowdyism." And the mention of rowdyism shows that it was already a known occurrence at Minnehaha Falls. And so it goes for 10 years of changing proprietors. All through the 1870s, the lease passes from one person to another. And with every change of management, the newspapers dropped hints that unseemly activities were available at the falls. Because why else would there be these recurring expectations that things were about to be greatly improved? But things did not go too badly wrong until Dutch Henry bought some land and built a competing hotel. And that, of course, is what we see here. From the book, I wrote, "Henry catered to the soldiers from the fort as they were the perfect clientele, hard drinking, close at hand, and with money to spend. He hired the Fort Snelling Band to play at dances at his place, and he advertised to attract the ladies. His dance hall became known for promiscuous gatherings of men and women of loose morals. He ignored the ban on Sunday liquor sales, a decision that led to reports of robberies and stabbings among his patrons. This was a rough spot. They went to his place to drink, the soldiers did, and the men from town went out to fight with the soldiers about who should be allowed to drink there. The military police from the fort were sometimes called in to keep order. And in 1879, Henry came up with a plan to reach even more customers by putting on minstrel shows. This was an era when America's chief entertainments included drinking, dancing, and racial hatred. This loathing was taught to white Americans through jokes and songs that are still sung today, like "Oh, Susanna" and "Hard Times" and "Camptown Raisins," and dozens of other songs from the era were all originally written to be performed in minstrel shows. And the Lincolns, by the way, running the hotel, thought that this was an absolute scandal, and they hated Henry's place because they brought the kind of level of social discourse down, down, down. Now, this picture doesn't look much like a hotel. And in fact, it has a sign on it, you've probably noticed, that says Minnesota Soldiers Home. And it's true that Dutch Henry's place was repurposed into the Soldiers Home for a short time when those 50 acres where we know the Soldiers Home is today was taken out of the park. It's a story that I tell in great detail in my book. Now, there's a lot of wonderful stories that I just don't have time to cover today, so I'm skipping over much of the 1880s with John Booth, the florist who set up at Minnehaha Falls. He sold refreshments and flowers, and eventually John Booth took over the lease on the Minnehaha Hotel, and he made the place a little more of a sideshow than it had been. He had something called a hurdy-gurdy swing that was never photographed but cost a nickel to ride, sounded noisy. And these were the years when the falls become increasingly irreverent and chaotic and boozy. And everything then changes in 1889 when the park board gains control of Minnehaha Falls after a multiple-year battle and many, many, many lawsuits. Now, this picture is from 1889, the year the park gets established. And it's taken from the edge of the waterfall. The picture on the left here, the smaller one, shows the skyline of the Soldiers' Home in the background. And there's a refreshment pavilion that you can see kind of through the trees. That's just where the Song of Hiawatha Garden is today. Now on the right, you can see a close-up of that pavilion, which I believe was run by a woman named Harriet Collar. She was in business in Minnehaha Park when the park board finally got the deed, finally took control, and the park board went right down to the park and told this woman she had 30 minutes to vacate. It was their land, not hers. She said, "But I have a lease, and I have a sick child here in my house." And the park board said, "We don't care," and they and their gang of men and maybe some cops took her building down around her and destroyed her home, and her sick child who was in the house died. The baby is buried in Pioneer and Soldier Cemetery. The transformation from private ownership to public park is a remarkable story, and I tell it in detail. Now, by the 1890s, the park board has chased out all of the refreshment vendors in the places where one could buy booze and get into trouble. The Minnehaha Hotel was burned to the ground by arsonists unknown in 1885. Henry's Hotel and John Booth's operations had both been removed from the park after the Soldiers' Home was built. And just outside the park, these refreshment vendors, the old ones and some new ones, have moved their operations. Now, pictures of places where one could indulge in bad behavior are incredibly rare. And I like to say that if you go looking for pictures of bad behavior and you limit that search to 125 acres in southeastern Hennepin County, the odds you're going to come up with anything are pretty much zero. And believe me, I have looked. But my story began to come together when I started looking at details of this actual picture. The photographer here is standing with his back to the east. He's facing west, and he is shooting right through the portico, the south portico of the Little Princess Depot that is still in the park today. And if we zoom in, we can see there's the shed roof of the depot, and looking through that, we see a man who seems to be looking down the tracks towards the city of Minneapolis. Probably he's waiting for the train. And there's a business that has a lot of signage, and then there's another business that he's standing in that has not any signage, and there's a few women sitting on a bench among the canna lilies, and probably they're waiting for the train too. Now, if we look at that well-signed business, it seems innocent enough. The Cass family ran it. They offered lunches, and they served cream soda and Ives ice cream. And other refreshment pavilions also existed in the park at this time and nearby. Unfortunately, I have no images of those. There was a man named Sidney Babcock, and he had a dance hall and pavilion south of this spot. Babcock catered to the soldiers from the fort and was a little boozier spot, just exactly like Henry's place had been the generation before him. Now, when Lewis Cass, who runs this lunch counter, took up a partner to run a business next to his, they, along with this Sidney Babcock, created a scene of scandal and disrepute. From the book, Adelbert Gardner built a dance hall right next to their confectionery stand, and they split the proceeds from these businesses. Cass and Gardner acquired a piano, hired some fiddle players and a dance caller, and began advertising dances at the falls. They started with 2 days a week, but soon they were having dances on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday. And while Sophia and Lewis Cass ran the confectionery side, Adelbert Gardner himself evidently worked the crowd to fill the dance floor with couples, all paying their nickels to dance quadrilles and waltzes. He would walk a man up to a single girl, ask her name, and introduce them. So matter-of-fact was he that the girls seemed to have no volition except to dance with the men the little fellow brought them, explained the Tribune. It was important to fill the dance floor not just to make money, but because quadrilles, which were a sort of square dance, required a set number of dancers. And women were forbidden to dance with each other so that the men would always have dance partners to choose from. The chief scandal of these dance halls was that unescorted young women went there to consort with the soldiers from Fort Snelling and with the young men of the city. While newspaper editors had an opinion about how much attention an unescorted young woman might want, the women had their own ideas. The streetcars were simply loaded with women. Some of them were factory girls who lived at home, dressed in their Gibson girl shirtwaists and their long skirts and wearing stylish black little sailor hats with veils. These young women anticipated rollicking fun at the falls. And to the annoyance of the well-bred and self-respecting ladies who lived in the newly built homes just to the west of Minnehaha Park, the women visiting the dance halls were not so constrained by Victorian virtue. The conflict seems too real to us today, too gentle to be real to us today, though the words used to describe each group are still with us. Straight-laced or loose, puritanical or permissive, conservative or liberal. Some of the women who frequented the pavilions were prostitutes. They called them the women who go to the falls on business. But most of them were independent wage earners with their own money to spend. Probably many of them were looking for a husband as well as a good time. People in higher social classes met their spouses by introduction and personal acquaintanceship. The women at the dance halls put a price on society's vision of their moral integrity. It was a 5-cent dance with men they did not know. And so continued the summer of 1895. Early August was as pleasant as it comes, not too hot in the bright, dry days and cooling at night. The season passed the worst of the mosquitoes as the sun set. People flocked to this new arrangement, dancing at Babcock's or Gardner's pavilion and strolling in couples between the two. Many of those strollers wandered over to see the waterfall or ducked into quiet areas of the park to be alone in the dark. The chirping of the crickets hailed the approaching autumn, and the dance hall patrons took full advantage of what Babcock, Cass, and Gardner offered, license to do as they pleased. Prostitutes went to the falls to work, factory girls and soldiers went to meet and carouse and drink, and the young men from the city, jealous of the attention the ladies gave the soldiers, went to the pavilions to pick fights. And this was, as you see in this headline, the great newspaper expose in 1895. 8 days after that newspaper story, on the moonless night of August 14th, the Cass and Gardner Pavilion burned to the ground. The fire started in the hall, not at the other end of the building where 9 people were sleeping. All escaped with the clothes on their back and little else. The place was a total wreck, and it had been closed for a few days because Sophia Cass had died suddenly, age 33, unknown causes, and Lewis and the 3 children were just home from Iowa where they took her to bury her. According to the St. Paul Globe and the Minneapolis Tribune, the fire was surely set. The Globe headline brought home the point about arson. The neighbors hated it. Lewis Cass lost everything he owned in that fire. He had no insurance, and the Cass children were made motherless and homeless in the same week. It was surely arson, but it did nothing to squelch the drunken rowdyism at the edge of the park, because 12 days after this fire, Adelbert Gardner took out a building permit for a brand new pavilion, 30 by 80 feet in size. And as the years went by, the new Gardner Pavilion is joined by other pavilions, and this becomes known as the Minnehaha Midway. It was all just to the west of the park. And this is the fire insurance map that helpfully shows Gardner's new pavilion. The buildings are colored in yellow here, and if they were standing today, they would be right between Minnehaha and Hiawatha Avenue, right kind of where the highway sits today. The arrow here shows where the Cass and Gardner Pavilion had been before it was burned down, and of course points at the railroad station, which is still there in the park. And then these set of arrows shows the Minnehaha Midway Pavilions. The one on the north side is one run by a man named Powdler, and then the Gardner Pavilion is the one closer to the railroad platform. The noise and chaos and drunken, rowdy behavior there caused rounds of arrests for selling alcohol without a license over the years. The paddy wagon would come again and again, and eventually in 1889, charges were brought against this Gardner family. Again, from my book, record-breaking crowds showed up in Judge Andrew Holt's tiny, dingy courtroom to testify for and against the goings-on at Gardner's Pavilion. The entire Minnehaha Improvement Association turned out, park police also, streetcar conductors, old soldiers from the home, all classes were represented. Even the girls who participated in the social parties were present to uphold the reputation of Gardner's Place. There were numbers of fair beings who have sometimes lost themselves in the mazes of the dance. I believe those are the prostitutes, who were there to tell what a nice place Gardner's resort was. And there were men of the Bowery variety also to add their good words to the others on behalf of this place of recreation. People living near the falls have been obliged to submit to insults at the hands of these habitués, have had their ears assailed with the noise of scrap and wassail, have been obliged to be referees in fights on streetcars, have dodged blows nightly on their trips in and out of town. They say they have borne more than they will bear again. The details came out. Young women as young as 14 or 15 years old were dancing a little bit too close to grown men that they did not know. Prostitutes offered more than that. The bargain and sale of personal charms were heard on the still night air. Now, liquor was actually not openly offered for sale, but the men carried their bottles and flasks in their pockets, and there was plenty of booze around. During this trial, witnesses from the neighborhood overwhelmed the court with complaints and stories about the intemperate behavior at Gardner's Pavilion and on the streetcars. James Hartzell lived in the neighborhood, and he testified on a noisy night. There was some hollering and some shooting. I walked down to the hall and looked in, and I heard foul language and swearing. And the city attorney asked, "What did they say?" And he said, "Well, I wouldn't like to say." But men were there who carried liquor with them, and they drank it on the premises. And I have seen gambling there on Mr. Gardner's grounds. Now, like I said, there aren't photographs to show all of this. But this editorial cartoon actually manages to capture the entire scene, because here we have fistfights, gambling, lewd dancing, they called this the Bowery Clutch, women drinking, women smoking, a woman offering her charms for sale, and drunks and bottles strewn across the landscape. And the oh-so-proper Mr. and Mrs. Minneapolis are leaving the area while the romantic vision of Minnehaha throws her hands up in horrified dismay. Basically, any bad behavior you could come up with in the 1890s was on display and available at these pavilions. And as the years go by, highwaymen are found lurking in the places, and so are counterfeiters and other crooks. The scale has changed from the reverence that we saw when the poem was at its height of fame to these venal carryings on and treating the place like a low resort. The clink of beer bottles drowned out the falling water. Now, in this lawsuit, the Gardners lost, but they didn't shut any of this down. They were fined $75. They paid it and went back to business. He enlarged his dance hall until it was over 150 feet long. And he began to lease the land to these other pavilions. So the Midway grows and grows and grows. And here, of course, we see a picture of the crowds milling around this small Ferris wheel soaring overhead. Now, the park board came up with a plan to combat this menace. It was outside of their land, but they were going to try and get the land underneath the park, which is a slow process, but they also decided they were going to compete with the pavilions on their own terms. They hired Jacob Barnett. He was an experienced concession runner. He had places at Lake Harriet and Wildwood and so on, all over the streetcar network. He and his brother did that. The park board gave Jacob Barnett permission to build, and he paid for the construction of this new building. It was a rectangle hall, as you can see, with covered porches, a simple and pretty design that was done by the architect Harry Wild Jones, who was also a park board member. And this opened in the spring of 1903. Now, the building was sited on the same picturesque point that overlooks the falls from the east, where the Song of Hiawatha Garden is today. It's the same place where Harriet Coller's pavilion had been and where her daughter died. Now, from the beginning, there were concerns that this building was simply too small. Including the piazza outside, it was only 40 feet by 60. And when it opened on May 24th, the Tribune reported that the crowds were the largest ever and completely overwhelmed the place. Every streetcar was loaded to the guards, and by 9 o'clock in the morning, every seat at every table was taken. Now, Barnett put up more awnings to provide more shaded seating, and he advertised for the dozens of employees he needed to help run this place. The plans for his building made a point of showing where the soft drinks counter would be. There would be no alcohol here, just clean and wholesome refreshments. And this was meant to take business from the other pavilions, and it did. It was such a wild success in its first week, the manager was constantly hiring, sometimes advertising for 20 waiters at a time. Now, this place lasted for just 2 seasons, because in October of 1904, it was burned to the ground by arsonists unknown. The Gardners were the people with the most to benefit? Who knows? Since no one lived particularly close by, the fire grew large before anyone noticed it, and by the time the neighbors arrived, the flames were spreading quickly. Bystanders tried to salvage what they could of the tables and chairs by stupidly going into a burning building. Someone said kerosene had been sprinkled around. Someone telephoned the fire department. But there was no fire station in this farthest southeast corner of the city, and so the response took quite a while. And when the firefighters finally arrived, they discovered there was no way to get water to their hoses. The fire started around 10 a.m., Long before morning, the park board's refectory was a smoldering heap of ashes and charred timber. In the war for the control of the park, arson was once again used to someone's advantage. Now, the neighborhood people understood that the pavilions and their rowdy behavior outside the park were not under the jurisdiction of the park board, but they did have one more card to play. They involved the railroad. The community's most prominent men enlisted the commercial club to their cause. They petitioned the park board already to acquire the strip of land under the pavilions, to take it from the landowners, just as they had taken the land at Minnehaha Falls the generation before. But they've decided it's time for reformation at Minnehaha. So this commercial club asked the Milwaukee Road to put up a 6-foot-tall fence along the west side of its right-of-way, making it impossible for the crowds to reach the midway from the tracks. And we see here in this picture that the fence is under construction. I know it's not a great photo. It really is all there is. This man is sitting on the ground. The fencing is being unrolled. The fence posts are in place. When the pavilion owners, who were led by Adelbert Gardner's son, Irwin, when they found out about this, they went to court to get an injunction to stop the fence's construction. And unfortunately, after a couple of weeks of courtroom monkeying around, the injunction is not granted. And the fence went up. It cut off access to all the pavilions. And their livelihood was threatened, and they knew it, and they took action, and that fence lasted just 3 weeks. Holes were cut in front of 7 pavilion doors, and much bluster came from this. The railroad was going to spend $20,000 to find the guilty parties, and they hired detectives and guards to protect their fence, which was, in fact, quickly repaired. But then gangs of suspicious men were prowling around on the railroad right-of-way, intimidating the guards and just causing this tension in the situation. The uneasy situation lasts until the end of the season, until November of 1903, when the park board finally met to discuss appraisals for the Midway land, which was an ongoing but slow process. And then in the season of 1904, the repaired fence is still in place. Much of the Midway land was, in fact, by this time owned by the park board, but the battle was far from over. The Midway pavilions, though the fence was shutting down their front doors, came up with a plan. They opened doors and windows in the backs of their buildings to face onto Hiawatha Avenue behind them. And on the Hiawatha Avenue side of their building, this made Hiawatha Avenue a carnival. And on the land on the far side, new businesses were going up. Here, oh, I guess I got ahead of myself. This guy is taking down the doors and windows. He's rebuilding the backs of these buildings to put in access for people. And then on the west side, new pavilions are going up, and there's an ice cream stand, tents, sideshows. People, they said, people of a certain class made the day and night hideous. Now, I've said how much I've learned from looking at small details in these pictures, and I just can't let this picture go by without pointing out this sad, racist mural inside one of the buildings. This is inside Powdler's Blue Star Pavilion, and it was just part of the landscape, not even worth commenting on, at Minnehaha Falls. So on July 1st, 1904, on the eve of the important and lucrative July 4th holiday, the resort owners decided that that fence had to go. One morning, the people of the area woke up and they found that 100 yards of fence had been all the posts sawed off, and the fence is just laying on the ground. It must have taken all night to do that. And the railroad was told by the pavilion keeper's attorney that now we are playing hardball. If you maintain the fence, Gardner's attorney says to the railroad, if you maintain that fence, we are going to go to court and we are going to sue you to force you to put that fence up, to force you to put up another fence on the other side of your right-of-way, 2 6-foot-tall fences each side of the tracks. There's a city law that says you have to have it, and you have to have gates and watchmen at every street crossing if the trains are moving through the city faster than 6 miles an hour. And the railroad tapped out. They stood down. The neighborhood said, well, now we have nothing but to wait for the leases to expire. Now, policing the Minnehaha Midway was not the duty of the park police. It wasn't in the park. But at this time, the park police sergeant, whose name was John F. O'Brien, and yeah, he lived in a house in the park. And even though these unwanted refreshment sellers and sideshows had been chased out of the park, all was not well in the park itself. Those young couples who were strolling between the two dance halls, he's shaking them down. He would go up to them and say, "You two, I saw what you were doing. Empty your pockets." And whatever they had, he would just take on threat of arrest. "I'm taking this gold piece, or we're going downtown," or that box of cigars, or her chocolates, or whatever. And he got away with this for years. He was the park superintendent as well as the lead policeman at Minnehaha. And he had some influence with the park board. He was paid about $75 a month as a policeman, but he presented a bill to the park board more than once for $200 for the task of turning the water on and off. And they voted for that. And then they reconsidered, and they voted it down the next month, but it was 6-3. I mean, there was some controversy among park board members on exactly what he meant to them, and he obviously had friends on the park board. So whatever shenanigans he had going on with the water supply, perhaps it's no surprise that when the firemen went to put out the pavilion fire, they couldn't get any water to their hoses. I'm sure he turned it off. Now, in 1905, the scandal breaks. John F. O'Brien had been having parties involving women and kegs of beer at the John H. Stevens house. Other policemen on the Minnehaha force, there was a force of 3, other policemen provided evidence for more crimes. John F. O'Brien eventually faced a laundry list of charges, including neglecting the animals in the zoo, shooting the deer in the zoo to eat at his keg party, which he called the Deer and Beer Party, stealing fodder from the zoo for his cows, stealing building materials, allowing unlicensed vendors in the park, firing employees who worked on Abraham Adams's political campaigns. That was a park board member. And then he was charged with this same little crime that I mentioned earlier, shaking down the public on threat of arrest. He was even, with this packed schedule also, and I don't see how he had time to fit it in, he was charged with sleeping on the job. Now, another park policeman named Burns said, "I know what's going on with him and the park board. I understand the whole story." This John F. O'Brien claims that he has something on William Berry. William Berry was the park board superintendent, and he had been since the beginning of the park board. Officer Burns says, he told me he has Berry right where he wants him, and I know why, and I'll tell you all about it. And the park board said, "Actually, no. William Berry is not on trial here. We will not embarrass Mr. Berry. We are only talking about O'Brien." And so they just don't allow this ever to be in the record. And I don't know how William Berry was being blackmailed, but there was certainly something going on there. They actually got O'Brien fired, and then he refused to quit. He showed up on the job and collected a paycheck for weeks after that, until finally someone went down to the comptroller or whoever writes the check, the payroll department, and said, "Stop paying him." And he eventually then moves right across the street. When he is fired, Abraham Adams, who's a park board, I think he might have been the park board president at that time, he quits and then takes the job as the park policeman, which seems a little unsavory to me. Anyway, from then on until 1907, when the Midway is quietly torn down, really nothing actually happens. It's very quiet. The businesses are just kind of withering away. When the leases expired, the gardeners were out, and that was the quiet end of the Minnehaha Midway. And this is the after picture. The depot is off to the left, and that might be the station agent who is standing on those boards which mark East 49th Street. Now, the story does continue in my book with a whole other set of problems concerning another hotel and another fence problem and continuing bad behavior from the park board and other shenanigans that don't really wind down until 1912 or so. But I would like, just at the end of my talk here, to address these broader questions of alcohol in society at the time. The neighborhood people had involved the railroad in the struggle for the soul of Minnehaha Park because the people hated walking past the drunks to get to the railroad and the streetcars. But some of those people who so hated the drunks were also involved in the temperance movement. And the prominent voice here is that of the Stockwells. And I talk about Albert Stockwell in this capacity in some detail in the book. Now, the Stockwells lived near today's Nokomis Library, and they were social liberals of the most devout and useful kind. Maud Stockwell was a leading voice in the suffragette movement. And Al Stockwell was a member of the ACLU and the NAACP, which I think was kind of unusual for a white man. He saw fairness in the single tax theory and the free silver movement. Those are both liberal political positions of his era, and they supported temperance. Now, Al Stockwell's mother might very well be in this picture. It was taken in Anoka, where he was born, and his mother was an absolute ardent temperance lady. The women, when they would go to a saloon and then pray for the end of the demon rum, preferred to do so on their knees, kneeling outside the saloons and praying to implore the saloon keeper to stop selling rum and ruining their families. But in this picture, we see there's a woman in the window upstairs looking down, and we see the ladies are on their feet, and not only that, they've got umbrellas, and it could very well be that the saloon keeper's wife has poured beer on their heads or even on the doorstep to prevent them from kneeling outside the business. Now, this early temperance work found a home in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which started in 1873 and still exists today, although there is no chapter in Minnesota. I did look for it. Through the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was a major force in promoting the idea that alcohol was a major social ill. They declared that marriages and families and men were ruined by drink. And when society began to loosen up, as we saw with the ladies going to Minnehaha for fun that included drinking, the voices of the WCTU got louder, and the loudest of these was the sensational Carrie Nation. In 1900, she believed that she heard the voice of God who told her to go to a saloon in her home state of Kansas and smash all the bottles in it. And she brought some rocks, she called them smashers, and she broke bottles and mirrors, and then she left. And for the next several years, she repeated and fine-tuned this antic behavior, eventually settling on a hatchet as her weapon of choice. She attracted a great deal of attention and a lot of jail time. In 1901, there was a threat of her coming to Minneapolis, and Mayor Ames, who I write about in some detail in the book, let it be known that he would have her instantly locked up if she tried one of her hatchetations. That's what she called it, a hatchetation, on a saloon in Minneapolis. He said it was as much his business to protect a saloon keeper's property as a dry good merchant's. Now, she did show up in 1903. In Minneapolis. And she was in town long enough to visit some dives, as they were called, where she attempted to pray a woman sex worker out of prostitution. She had many negative things to say in Minneapolis about the scandalous way women revealed their figures. Corsets, my friends, corsets. And she went into a saloon in St. Paul and she called the men there thieves, scoundrels, beasts, and said they were ruining their health. And when she advanced on the bartender, he took out a siphon and sprayed her with seltzer water. This was a tactic that the saloon keepers had developed in the time that she took over the spotlight of temperance. Other bartenders made fun of her. They invented cocktails named for Carrie Nation, and people said those were smashing good drinks. Carrie Nation turned up at Minnehaha Falls just in the same week that the war with the pavilion keepers was warming up. During the week of court filings and injunctions to try and stop the fence, and the gardeners are making all of this noise, Carrie Nation turned up at the falls. Now, sadly, for a great story, she did not hatchet anything, and I kind of wish she had. She lectured the smokers, and she confiscated their cigars and cigarettes. Her most sensational exploit was on the streetcar returning from the falls. There was an advertisement for a resort on White Bear Lake that had a roller coaster and a casino, as well as a tastefully dressed young woman attired in a bathing costume, perhaps like the one we see here. And she was making ready to dive into the lake, and Mrs. Nation took that advertisement off the wall of the streetcar, tore it up, threw it out the window, and sat back folding her arms with a satisfied smirk. And that, with a little detour, is the end of my talk. Thank you all so much for listening. And of course, I can take questions if anyone has any. I don't know how close we are to lunchtime.
I was just curious when the name of the creek and the falls was formally changed from Browns Creek to Minnehaha Creek and
Never.
Browns
It was
Falls.
never formally changed. Never. What happened is that common usage just took over. The military called it Browns Creek, Browns Falls, and they were using that to honor Jacob Brown, Major General Jacob Brown, who is the man who ordered the U.S. 5th Infantry to the area of the confluence to build Fort Snelling. It wasn't Joseph R. Brown, for whom we know Brown County was named and who was a trader in the area, because when all of that happened, Joseph R. Brown was a little kid. He was 15 years old. So Browns Creek was a military use. Everybody else in the area called it the Little Falls. And it actually is much taller than St. Anthony Falls, but they called it the Little Falls because its drainage was so much smaller. It didn't have the water power. St. Anthony Falls was obviously the economic engine that built the city, and so that was the main waterfall, and this one was the Little Falls. So in 1855, when the poem is published, that's when Minnehaha Falls gets firmly stuck onto the waterfall, and those other names just kind of withered away in usage. There's probably people who called it the Little Falls until they died in 1890, because that's what they were accustomed to. But there was never anyone saying, all right, now we're all changing what we're doing. It just, over time, that's just how it just played out. And it was because of the poem. Yeah.
Karen, you teased at the beginning about one thing that you wish you could change, that you noticed after the book was published.
Yeah. Oh, that was just that I would love to have more pictures. I would love to have, I have so many pictures, and I had to pick a bare handful. And it's also true that the big collecting institutions, they collect one thing, or they collect across a broad range of things. So they're going to pick the best of each. And my collection is just like everything. And so some of the pictures, like the one I showed you of the pavilions in Hiawatha Avenue, I don't own that picture. That one's at the State Historical Society because they've got this one important good image. But my story came out of all these tiny little details. I could show you quickly what it's like. These are pictures of Minnehaha Falls, right? Here's one, and there's another one, and that's one too, and we got another one after that. And here's some people. They built that platform, right? And you're starting to say, yep, Karen, these all look exactly alike, and so what? But if you look at the same picture again, I'll show you what I see. I'm looking at these little details. I'm looking at these little buildings, these straight architectural lines, the railroad tracks. In this picture, I'm looking at this barely visible little bridge footing that showed me that there had been a bridge there at one point, and where did it go, and when did that happen? And this is how I'm building the story, right? This fence, who built that? Whose land was that on? In this picture, again, the fence is still there. Okay, time has passed. And this tree, which happens to be a butternut tree, has a broken branch. Who did that, and when, and why? Here we see this railing that goes behind the falls, as well as this platform railing. And here in this group picture, the fence is gone at the top of the falls. You can see that there's been changes, right? So what is the order of these changes, and how do those things happen? And this picture is absolutely marvelous, and I wish it was in better shape, because while it looks like a fairly faded and pedestrian picture of Minnehaha Falls, not only do we see the railroad bridge back behind, but we see not one but 2 footbridges below the falls, because the new one was built and the old one was still sort of crumbling away. And then this picture, I like to say, is the one that really helped me find the story in some significant ways, because it looks like a lovely picture behind the waterfall, but when you look a little closer, you see that there's the roof of the Minnehaha Hotel peering over the edge. And so those are the kinds of things that I just, like small details, maybe they're interesting to you, they absolutely fascinate me, and that's how I wanted to, that's what I would have liked to include in the story. It's just like little bits of stuff, tiny pieces over many years collected to tell the story. So, yeah.
One question I had for you was, what repositories did you, I know you've been collecting for years yourself, but also I know you've kind of traveled around the country to get some of these images.
Yeah, well, I have a reader card at the Library of Congress. I have a reader card at Harvard University, and I have one at the New York Public Library. You can go there and get a card, and they'll pull stuff from their collections. I've been to the New York Historical Society on Central Park West, because they have, in just one example, they have the history of the Crystal Palace. And you can say, like, and what is the Crystal Palace and why do we care? It was America's first World's Fair. And in my book, I talk about whether or not that early picture of Minnehaha Falls, that first one that we saw, whether or not that picture was actually taken by Hessler, and if that picture went to Longfellow, as Hessler claimed. And so that's like a kind of a small part of the story, but I wanted to find out about that because the guy, he said, took the picture to Longfellow was also at the Crystal Palace. At the same time, is that the transmission point? Can we prove that or disprove that? And I get that that's small potatoes. I get that that's a tiny thing, but I spend a lot of time on that looking for ways to prove a story that really isn't documented in its own time, right? There's just hints of bad behavior. Nobody says, and then I drank this much, and then this happened, and then I went to jail, and this is what bail cost. Like all of those parts of the real meaty details don't exist. So finding out what happened is putting things together in a very, very small way. And so reading microfilm letters at Harvard University, pulling things out of the collection at the public library. There was, at one point I found at OSU in their collection, they had a glass plate picture of Minnehaha Falls, and it was 60 centimeters. That's like 2 feet, this glass plate negative. Could I see that, please? Because, of course, the detail will be fantastic. And so they're like, no, it's too fragile. No, we can't make pictures of it. No this, no that. And finally, they sent me a little teeny tiny, okay, here's the idea of it. And I looked at that picture, and I said, that's not Minnehaha Falls. It really isn't. And then I sent them back a nice note saying, here are the details in it that prove it is not Minnehaha Falls. Like there's no pine trees at Minnehaha Falls, or at least there weren't then. And so like these are the little research rabbit holes I go down. I've been to the Getty Museum and any online repository that I can find. I've been to the bottom of that probably. And
Very impressive.
Well, you get fascinated, right? You get interested in something, and it possesses you. If you guys have never had that experience, I assure you it's both fun and annoying. Yeah. Anybody else have a question? Friendly comment?
If not, thank you. This was just fantastic. Yeah. And for those of you who are going to the luncheon, you're welcome to head over there. If you need a copy of the book or if you need your copy signed,
I brought a pen.
Available for that. Thank you so much for coming. This was really great.